The scent of thousands of white lilies was supposed to be calming. Instead it felt suffocating, a cloying sweetness that clung to the back of my throat. I stood before the gilded mirror, a stranger swathed in ivory silk and a fortune in hand-stitched lace. Ilara Vance, soon-to-be wife of Kalin Thorn. The name felt like a costume I was putting on, one that didn't quite fit. The door to the bridal suite burst open without a knock, and the hushed, reverent atmosphere shattered. Isolde stood there, a vision of calculated innocence in pale blue chiffon. The crowd of capital elite, young socialites and old money titans, parted for her like she was royalty. Their eyes were wide, not with concern, but with the avaricious gleam of spectators at a Roman circus. She didn't even look at my dress, my hair, the carefully constructed image of a blushing bride. Her eyes, cold and sharp as chips of glass, went straight to mine in the mirror's reflection. "The one who isn't loved is the real home wrecker," she announced, her voice a carrying melodic poison. "What does it matter if you marry Kalin, Ilara? I'm still the woman he cherishes most in his heart." The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the plush carpet. Everyone knew the stories. Kalin Thorn's devotion to his little orphan muse was the stuff of legend in our circles. I was the interloper the new money upstart bought with a business deal. Before I could form a response, the air shifted again. Kalin arrived. My fiancé. His presence was like a winter frost settling over the room. His face, handsome in a cold, sculpted way, was its usual mask of indifference. But then his eyes found Isolde. It was like watching ice melt. His gaze softened, warmed, became something painfully tender. Something I knew I would never see directed at me. That look, the sheer public audacity of it, snapped something inside me. When his eyes flicked back to me, the frost returning instantly, the break was complete. "What are you standing here for?" he said, his voice devoid of any emotion that should accompany a wedding day. "The ceremony is about to begin." I ignored him. My entire world had narrowed to the smug, pretty face of the girl before me. A slow, dangerous smile spread across my lips. It felt good. It felt real. "Would you dare to repeat what you just said?" My voice was quieter than hers, but it cut through the silence like a knife. Emboldened by Kalin's presence, Isolde scoffed, a pretty tinkling sound. She lifted her chin and loudly, clearly repeated her vile little speech. She didn't get to finish. My arm swung out, a piston driven by years of early morning boxing sessions and weight training. The crack of my palm against her cheek was obscenely loud in the hushed room. It wasn't a ladylike tap. It was a full-force blow that snapped her head to the side. A red, hand-shaped mark bloomed instantly on her pale skin. A single perfect drop of blood welled from her nostril, tracing a path through her powder and ruining her carefully constructed, pitiable aura. She stood there, stunned, one hand pressed to her face, her eyes wide with a confusion so profound it was almost funny. Smack, smack. I hit her twice more left and right, the sharp reports echoing like firecrackers. The crowd gasped as one. "Kalin Thorn's beloved woman," I mused aloud, my voice dripping with a mockery so thick you could taste it. "I'm simply dying of envy." Kalin finally broke from his stupor. His hand, large and bruising, snapped out and seized my raised wrist. "Ilara, haven't you caused enough trouble? Isolde is just a child. How could you hit her over a few childish words?" I wrenched my wrist from his grasp, not out of weakness but out of sheer disgust. "She's just a kid and you're being ambiguous with her," I retorted, my voice dropping to a low, icy register. "Are you some kind of pervert?" The insult hung in the air. Before he could process it, my other hand swung up and I slapped him hard across his perfectly sculpted face. The sound was even more satisfying than Isolde's. I sneered at his shocked expression. "You probably don't know this, but back overseas they call me the Chinese Nine Pearls. My nickname is the Slapping War Goddess." I shoved him back, a man who had never been shoved in his entire privileged life, and pointed a finger at his nose. "I spent $1.5 billion on a business marriage alliance with you, and you pull this golden canary literature crap on me, you old pervert. If you want to sleep with young girls, just say it outright. Stop feeding me this grooming, disgusting nonsense." With that, I reached up, ripped the delicate white veil from my hair, and slammed the heavy bridal bouquet directly into his chest. He staggered back, a comical look of outrage on his face. "If this mess isn't cleaned up today, nobody gets to continue with this damn wedding," I declared to the room at large. You think I give a damn about marrying you? Men lining up to court me stretch all the way to France. Who the hell are you to be picky? If your old man hadn't begged on his knees before me, you think you'd even get a chance at this marriage alliance? Go fuck yourself. I turned on my heel, the train of my obscenely expensive gown swirling around me, and swaggered out of the room. I left behind a vacuum of silence, then a rising tide of scandalized whispers. I didn't go far. My mother, Lydia Vance, was waiting in a private anteroom. She wasn't wringing her hands. She was standing by the window, a glass of whiskey in her hand, and she turned as I entered. She looked me up and down from my furious face to my bare head, and a slow, fierce grin spread across her face. She gave me a sharp, approving thumbs up. Pure dominance, she said, her voice rich with pride. That's my girl. I collapsed onto a silk-upholstered sofa, the adrenaline beginning to recede, leaving a cold, clear certainty in its wake. They wanted to test my obedience, I said, kicking off my heels. The Thorn family is crumbling. They need my money like a drowning man needs air, but their pride is too vast to simply ask. They thought they could publicly humiliate me, make me feel so small and inferior that I'd beg them to take my dowry with both hands. My mother, a woman who had built a global empire from a single steel mill, nodded, her eyes sharp. Laughable. Such audacity would make a dog shake its head. We knew we weren't alone. The Thorns would have spies everywhere. So we gave them a show. My mother, who had fought her way up from the streets, was a virtuoso of inventive insult. For a solid 30 minutes, she unleashed a verbal torrent that would make a sailor blush, her voice shrill and carrying, creatively dragging every single Thorn ancestor out of their graves for a thorough and profane tongue-lashing. I fanned the flames, adding my own pointed commentary. We were a symphony of rage. Finally, we heard a muffled curse and the sound of someone stomping away from the door. Who knew they couldn't handle it? Lydia said, taking a leisurely sip of whiskey. They shouldn't have brought that little wretch to the wedding in the first place. An hour later my phone buzzed. A text from Cordelia Thorn, the matriarch. A vague, lofty plea for me to forgive Kalin and attend the wedding for her sake. I laughed, a cold, hard sound. Your dignity is nothing but a pile of dog shit, I muttered to the phone. I didn't text back. I called Kalin directly. He answered on the first ring, probably on speakerphone with his mother. I didn't let him speak. Kalin, I'm giving you 5 minutes. You and that little brat you're raising better be at my door to apologize, you absolute scumbag. My voice was low and lethal. If you don't come, remember that financial big shot you recently found to manage your assets? My headquarters are overseas. The fund industry is doing all right. From now on, if you dare to be late, I'll go against you. You short, I'll go long. You go long, I'll short. I've got plenty of money to burn. You're 1 minute late, I'll make you lose 10 million. I mean what I say. I hung up. 3 minutes later, the door to the anteroom flew open. A livid Kalin and a tearful red-cheeked Isolde stood there. I remained on the sofa, a queen holding court. I fixed my gaze on Isolde, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. Isolde, I know you're just a child and I can understand that you don't always watch your words. It's all right. I'll teach you slowly after I enter the Thorn family. I reached into my discarded handbag and pulled out a thick stack of cash. You're the child Kalin keeps by his side, so naturally I'll be your stepmother now. Call me Mom, and I'll give you the customary gift money for changing how you address me. Isolde looked at Kalin, her eyes pleading, but he was staring at the floor, his jaw clenched so tight I thought it might crack. Under the weight of my expectant gaze, she finally broke. She lowered her head, her voice a barely audible whisper. Mother. I laughed, raised my hand and flung the cash in her face. The bills fluttered around her like confetti. Good girl. What Mom likes most are girls with self-respect and dignity. Learn more from me in the future. Don't fill your head with nothing but men. That's a romantic fixation. Or in other words, a mental illness that needs treatment. I stood, smoothed down my wedding gown and turned to Kalin. What are you waiting for? Scope. Our guests are waiting. I walked out, my head high, leaving them standing in a shower of money and humiliation. The wedding ceremony was a blur of recited vows I didn't mean and rings that felt like shackles. But I had won the first battle. The war for my future in this city I knew had only just begun. The wedding reception was a masterclass in hypocrisy. I floated through the crowds on Kalin's arm, a beautiful, smiling mannequin. The whispers followed us, but they were different now. They weren't whispers of pity for the nouveau riche outsider. They were whispers of fear, of curiosity, of newfound respect. I had drawn a line in the sand with my open palm, and everyone had seen it. I played my part perfectly. I chatted with politicians' wives, laughed at bankers' jokes, and discussed market trends with industry titans. I was no longer just a Lara Vance, the bride. I was a Lara Vance Thorn, an entity to be reckoned with, a woman who had slapped sense into the capital's most talked-about drama on her own wedding day. The story was already spreading, I knew. It would be the gossip of every club and salon for weeks. Later, in the oppressive opulence of the Thorn master bedroom, the mask finally came off. Kalin entered, slamming the door behind him. The scent of expensive whiskey clung to him, but it couldn't mask the fury rolling off him in waves. "I'm telling you, Alara," he spat, his words slightly slurred, "you may have my body now, but you'll never have my heart." I was standing by the window looking out at the manicured gardens below. I didn't turn around. A derisive snort escaped me. "Who wants your pig-like physique?" I said, my voice flat. "Just one more glance at your pale, porky body makes me nauseous. I can't stand pork. Get out." I finally turned to face him. The insult was so crude, so unexpected from a woman in a wedding gown, that it left him speechless for a crucial second. In that second, I closed the distance between us and planted my hands on his chest. With a sharp shove, fueled by a day's worth of pent-up rage, I pushed him backward. He stumbled, his legs tangling in an ornate Persian rug, and landed with a heavy thud on the hard marble floor of the hallway. I slammed the door shut and turned the lock with a satisfyingly loud click. I could hear him sputtering in indignation on the other side. I didn't care. I stripped off the wedding gown, letting the expensive silk pool on the floor like a shed skin, and put on my own silk pajamas. The bed was enormous and ridiculously comfortable. I slept like a baby. The next morning I awoke with the sun, refreshed and buzzing with purpose. I dressed not as a wife but as a CO. A sharp black tailored pantsuit, my hair pulled back in a severe knot. My mother had taught me that the personal is political and the domestic is economic. My first battle today was for control of the household. I summoned the entire staff to the grand foyer. They assembled under the crystal chandelier, a sea of black and white uniforms, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Sterling, the long-serving butler, stood at the front, his posture ramrod straight, his expression one of polite condescension. I walked a slow circle around him, letting the silence stretch. "Who is paying your salary now?" I asked, my voice cool and clear. "It is you, madam," he replied, his tone impeccably respectful, though his eyes held a flicker of defiance. I nodded slowly. I picked up a delicate bone china teacup from a nearby console table. "Since you know who puts food on your table," I said, stirring the air with an imaginary spoon, "then don't bite the hand that feeds you." I stopped and looked directly at him, then let my gaze sweep over the rest of the staff. "Be careful or I'll fire the lot of you. Let's see if those old fools would still want you then." The threat hung in the air, cold and absolute. I saw the younger maids flinch, their eyes dropping to the floor. The power dynamic in the room shifted palpably. As the staff scattered back to their duties like startled birds, I looked up. Kalin was standing on the second-floor landing, leaning on the balustrade, watching me. His face was pale, shadows under his eyes. He'd clearly had a miserable night. "Come down if you have something to say," I called up, my voice echoing in the vast space. "I hate looking up at people." He descended the stairs slowly, each step seeming to cost him effort. "The young master isn't used to sleeping on the floor," I remarked, not even trying to hide my amusement. "Ilara," he seethed, ignoring the jab. "Why must you be so ruthless?" "Ruthless?" I raised an eyebrow. "This is called employee discipline. If they listen to me and fulfill their responsibilities, I certainly won't be stingy. Clear rewards and punishments. That's the basic logic of doing business. Have you been in power at the Thorn family for so long without learning that yet?" His jaw tightened. I could see him wrestling with his pride, forcing himself to change the subject to what really mattered to him. "When are you going to give me that 1.5 billion? The audacity was breathtaking. I let out a short, humorless laugh. "Why should I give you my dowry? Did you even give me a betrothal gift before asking for my dowry? What do you want my dowry for?" the rapid-fire questions visibly through him. He clenched his fists. The Thorn family has been facing difficulties. A shortage of funds. We need your dowry as an investment. As for the betrothal gifts, we owe you an apology. An apology. As if that was currency. I laughed again, this time with genuine scorn. An ambiguous, sorry, and you want my 1.5 billion? Dream on. I crossed my legs, leaning back against the sofa as if I owned it, which technically I now partly did. Want my dowry? Sure. But every penny you invest, every fund you inject into the Thorn Empire must pass through my people's hands. Every business move you make must be reviewed by my assistant in advance. His face flushed a deep, ugly red. The carefully cultivated aristocratic cool evaporated. Elara, don't push your luck too far. I've never seen a woman as mean as you. That did it. I shot to my feet, grabbed the actual teacup from the table and slammed it onto the marble floor. It exploded into 1,000 pieces, the sound shockingly loud. Kalin Thorn, you're such a hypocrite. I snarled, stepping over the shards. When your Thorn family wouldn't spare a single penny and denied me access to resources, you couldn't even squeeze out a fart. Now that it's my turn, you call me harsh. I got right in his face, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. Let me tell you, for a business marriage alliance, if you want cooperation and mutual exchange of resources, I have no problem. But if you think you can freeload off me, I'd like to see how many lives you have to spare for such stupidity. I stood back, looking him up and down with utter contempt. I know you like gentle ones, but your preference is no different to me than dog shit. Think carefully about your own commercial value. Show your sincerity and then come back to discuss cooperation with me. Without waiting for a response, I turned my back on him. Sterling was already there, holding out my coat and bag, his earlier condescension replaced by palpable fear. I took them and walked out of the manor into the morning light. I inhaled the crisp air. This was where I belonged, not in gilded cages playing domestic politics. I had a city to conquer. My driver pulled up and I slid into the back seat, already pulling out my phone to check my schedule. The Thorn Manor was behind me. My future was ahead. The Thorn Manor receded in the tinted window of my town car, a gilded cage growing smaller and smaller. I didn't look back. The confrontation with Kalin had been invigorating, a necessary clearing of the air. He now understood the terms of our arrangement. This was a merger, not a surrender. My real work began at the sleek, modern skyscraper that housed my company's new capital headquarters. The marriage alliance had been the key, but now the tedious, exhilarating work of building something lasting commenced. Days blurred into a whirlwind of meetings. I sat across from grizzled suppliers who thought they could bully the new girl, smooth-talking contractors with inflated quotes, and potential partners who tested the waters with cautious curiosity. My wedding day performance had preceded me. The story of the slapping war goddess was too delicious not to spread. It granted me a peculiar kind of respect. They might not like me, but they were increasingly afraid to underestimate me. The initial condescension I faced melted away under the heat of my preparation, my ruthless negotiation tactics, and my encyclopedic knowledge of their own industries. I wasn't just a purse. I was a sharp, strategic mind, and they were forced to acknowledge it. Seeing the Thorn family's newfound, if gritted teeth, compliance, I decided to make a move. A show of force needed a show of faith. I transferred the first tranche of the promised dowry, a sum so large it made my accountant visibly pale, into the crumbling accounts of the Thorn Group. The money was a lifeline, and they took it with the sullen gratitude of a debtor who knows they're beholden. But my faith was strictly conditional. I had my lawyers draft a contract so watertight it could survive a tsunami. It stipulated that if the Thorn Group failed to meet the aggressive, almost punitive profit targets I had set within 3 months, the financial faucet would be turned off permanently. No second chances. I sent it to Kalin via a process server. My assistant Mina brought me the signed copy later that day. Her brow was furrowed with concern. President Vance, she said, her voice hesitant, forgive me, but the terms are severe. Aren't we pushing too hard? Being so relentless. I took the document, its pages crisp and authoritative. I flicked it with a satisfied smile. Mina, you're still young. You see relentlessness. I see necessity. Dealing with the Thorns requires a firm hand. They look down on everything I represent. The moment a woman operates with the same assertiveness as a man, she's labeled mean or harsh. I waived the contract. This is just basic business. It's them who've forgotten how it's done. Under the lash of my financial whip, the moribund Thorn Group began to stir. Kalin, terrified of me cutting off the funds that were paying for his lifestyle and propping up his legacy, actually started to work. He implemented changes, shook up complacent departments, and stirred up a hornet's nest of internal resentment. He came home later each night, smelling of whiskey and defeat, often sleeping in a guest room without another word exchanged between us. His silence was a victory I cherished. It was only when the final permits were approved for my headquarters construction that I remembered the other loose end in this tangled web. Isolde. Sterling, the butler, now the picture of obsequious efficiency, approached me one evening after dinner. "Madam," he said, bowing slightly. "A reminder that Miss Isolde's birthday is next week. Mr. Thorn traditionally hosts a gala in her honor here at the manor." "Ah, yes. The annual celebration of the cherished ward." I nodded. "See to the arrangements, Sterling. The usual standard." I went through the motions. I had my secretary acquire a stunning set of diamond earrings and a matching necklace, cold, brilliant, and impersonal. I presented them to Isolde in the drawing room a few days before the event. She took the velvet box, her expression a masterpiece of conflicted emotion. She tried to maintain her haughty aloofness, but her eyes, those traitors, glittered with undeniable avarice. The diamonds sparkled, and so did her ambition. "Enjoy the sparkle," I thought, a plan crystallizing in my mind. "It's the last gift you'll receive as the star of this particular show." The night of the gala, I made my entrance. I chose a dress the color of spilled blood, a deep, vicious red that hugged every curve. At my throat rested the ruby necklace my mother had won at auction, the main stone a deep, bloody crimson. I was the villainess in their fairy tale, and I embraced the role utterly. Isolde was a vision of washed-out innocence in pale pink chiffon, her curls artfully arranged to appear effortless. Kalin looked at her as if she were a delicate angel. When his gaze slid to me, it was like watching a shutter slam down, his expression closing off into familiar irritation. I smiled sweetly and touched up my lipstick in the reflection of a gilded picture frame. We played our parts. We entered the ballroom arm in arm, the picture of conjugal unity for the flashing cameras. The air was thick with unspoken questions. I soon detached myself from him, a glass of champagne in my hand, and began to work the room in earnest. The conversation was different now. The men who had once patronized me now listened. Really listened. After a few rounds of discussing market fluctuations and supply chain logistics, their expressions shifted from politeness to genuine engagement. I was no longer a novelty, I was a peer. Needing a moment of quiet, I excused myself and slipped toward the restroom. As I approached, I heard the unmistakable hushed tones of young women. "Never expected Isolde's stepmother to be so formidable," a voice whispered from around the corner. A second voice, laced with a familiar, petty cruelty, answered. "What can she do? Our families have been in the capital for generations. There's no need to fawn over her. Isolde's enemy is our enemy. Don't you dare be nice to her." I rounded the corner. They were a group of 3, dressed in pastels, their faces frozen in shock at my sudden appearance. I didn't say a word. I simply washed my hands, meeting their eyes in the mirror, a small, cold smile on my lips. Their cheeks flushed crimson. I dried my hands slowly, deliberately, and left them standing there in silence. Silly little girls, I thought, my amusement warring with contempt. You're playing with dolls while I'm playing with empires. By the time you inherit your titles, I'll own the ground they're built on. I returned to the ballroom to find the main event beginning. A spotlight had found Isolde and Kalin in the center of the dance floor. His gaze was soft, proprietary. "Today is our Isolde's 18th birthday," he announced, his voice filled with a warmth he reserved only for her. "We wish her safety, peace, and happiness every day." He lifted an antique diamond tiara from a velvet cushion, a piece I knew he'd spent an obscene amount of money on at a Sotheby's auction, and placed it gently on her head. It was a coronation. A murmur of approval swept through the crowd. I saw people nodding, their glances saying, "See? She's still the favorite." Isolde, with the tiara glittering in her hair, lifted her chin. Her eyes scanned the crowd, found me, and held my gaze. A gentle, triumphant, deeply provocative smile touched her lips. "Mother," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "What are you planning to give me?" The challenge was thrown down. Kalin had set the bar at a king's ransom. Anything less from me would be seen as a loss, proof that I was the petty, stingy nouveau riche they all thought I was. I smiled, a slow, enigmatic unfurling of lips. I didn't move. I simply raised my hands and brought them together in 3 slow, deliberate claps. The sound echoed in the suddenly quiet room. On cue, Sterling stepped forward, bearing not a jewelry box, but a simple, heavy, cream-colored envelope on a silver tray. I walked over, lifted the envelope and with a flourish presented it to Isolde. Her smile was condescending as she took it, expecting a check she could dismiss. She slid a single sheet of heavy, embossed paper from inside. Her eyes scanned the text. Her smile vanished. The color drained from her face, then flooded back in a wave of shock. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide, staring at me in utter disbelief. The tiara on her head suddenly looked foolish, a child's toy. The crowd leaned in, buzzing with confusion. "Mom knows you excel in your studies," I said, my voice projecting warm, maternal pride across the silent ballroom. "You have high standards and you demand much from your education. So, I asked Professor Shinli Yuan to write you a recommendation letter." A collective gasp went up. Professor Yuan was a mythic figure in legal academia. His recommendations were unicorns, rumored to exist but never seen. "He is recommending you," I continued, savoring every word, "to the law faculty of the University of Munich. For your 18th birthday I give you a bright future. A wonderful life of your own making." The silence was absolute. Isolde's hand trembled, the paper shaking. Her face was a war zone of emotions. Shock, awe, greed, and a dawning, terrifying realization. This was an offer she could not refuse. It was a door opening to a world far bigger than Kalin Thorn's gilded parlor. It was also a one-way ticket out of my life. Kalin and the other Thorn family members stood rigid, their faces masks of stiff horror. They had planned to keep Isolde here, a tool to use against me, a distraction. I had just checkmated them with a single, brilliant, devastating move. Isolde looked from the letter to Kalin, then back to me. The battle in her eyes was brief. Ambition, that most primal of instincts, won. Her shoulders slumped, then straightened with a new purpose. "Mother," she said, and this time the word was not a challenge but a surrender. It was laced with something akin to genuine, bewildered gratitude. "Thank you." I smiled, the victor. Go to Germany, I thought, the triumph cold and sweet in my veins. Go study law. Let those 3 years feel like 7. By the time you graduate, you'll be so thoroughly cleansed of any romantic notions about that man, he'll be nothing but a dusty memory. The game I knew was changing. And I was now several moves ahead. The days following the birthday gala were a study in shifting dynamics. The Thorn Manor, always a mausoleum of quiet resentment, now hummed with a new, frantic energy. It was the energy of Isolde's panic. The recommendation letter, that single sheet of expensive paper, had acted like a spell. The pretty, passive doll was gone, replaced by a girl possessed. German law textbooks, verb conjugation charts and flashcards littered the sunroom. The sound of her frantically repeating phrases to a language tutor became the manor's new soundtrack. I played my part to perfection. I was the supportive, if stern, stepmother. I hired the best tutors money could find, stern, uncompromising academics who didn't care about her connection to the Thorns, only her mastery of dative cases and legal terminology. I made a show of inquiring after her progress, of ensuring she had the perfect quiet space to study. It was a beautiful, gilded cage of my own making. Kalin watched it all unfold with a kind of helpless, simmering fury. His toy was being taken away, repurposed for a future that didn't revolve around him. I could see him itching to intervene, to whisk her away for a weekend in the country, to remind her of the life of pampered indolence he offered. He tried once, hovering near the sunroom door. "Isolde, my dear, you look exhausted. The weather is beautiful. Perhaps a drive would clear your head." I was there before he could finish, materializing at his side like a well-dressed ghost. My voice was a syrupy whisper laced with poison. "Kalin, darling, Isolde is at a critical juncture. If you truly love her, don't distract her now." I paused, letting the condescension drip. Though I may not be well educated myself, I still know the saying, all occupations are inferior, only studying is exalted. Isn't it a good thing that Isolde enjoys her studies? The phrase "not well educated" hit its mark with the precision of a scalpel. I saw him flinch. It had taken him weeks, but his bruised pride had finally compelled him to have me properly investigated. The report on his desk would have been a brutal read. Ilara Vance. Top of her class, Faculty of Law, University of Munich. Double degree, Law and Finance. Dropped out of postgraduate studies to found Vance Holdings at age 22. Net worth, estimated $4.2 billion. He, the big shot of the capital's elite, had skated by on a mediocre degree bought with family donations. The knowledge was a constant, humiliating itch he couldn't scratch. He shot me a look of pure, unvarnished hatred before turning on his heel and retreating to his study, the door slamming shut behind him. His absence suited me perfectly. It gave me space to focus on building my own empire brick by brutal brick. One Friday I was deep in negotiations at an exclusive club famed for its tranquil Jiangnan garden setting. The meeting was with a consortium of suppliers who thought they could hold me over a barrel due to a recent bottleneck. They were older, their bellies full of rich food and their minds full of outdated notions. After 2 hours of skillful maneuvering, a blend of veiled threats, dazzling charm and cold, hard facts about their own operational weaknesses, I secured the agreement I wanted. I had them at the absolute lowest margin they would accept, a point where they made just enough profit to save face. The lead supplier, a man named Wang, mopped his brow with a silk handkerchief and forced a bitter smile. "President Vance," he said, his voice grudgingly respectful, "dealing with you is truly difficult." I beamed, a brilliant, disarming smile. I raised my glass of mineral water. "President Wang flatters me. The feeling is mutual." Needing to escape the cloying smell of cigar smoke and male entitlement, I excused myself and slipped out through a side door that led to a secluded rooftop garden. The city lights sprawled before me, a map of power and opportunity. I fumbled in my clutch for my cigarette case, craving the sharp bite of nicotine. That's when I heard them. The voices were hushed but carried easily in the still night air. Kalin and his mother, Cordelia. They were hidden from view by a large decorative screen, but their words were crystal clear. Cordelia's voice was stripped of its usual society matron gentility. It was low, hoarse, and sharp as a razor. "Why haven't you dealt with Ilara yet? Don't tell me you can't even handle a woman." Kalin's reply was thick with irritation and what sounded like fear. "It's not that I don't want to act. He's too alert. She's not an easy target. That 1.5 billion can't just fall into our hands directly." The old woman sneered. "She's just a woman. How capable can she be? Wasn't your sister-in-law also a tough nut to crack at first? But in the end she still coughed up all her dowry." The mention of Kalin's late sister-in-law sent a cold trickle down my spine. I'd heard the official story, a tragic riding accident. Cordelia's next words were uttered with a chilling offhand casualness that froze the blood in my veins. "If she's unwilling to give the dowry, that's easy to handle. Turn her into a vegetable. Then all her money will be ours, right? Just like what we did to your sister-in-law back then. Don't tell me you can't even handle such a small task." I stopped breathing. The cigarette case felt cold and heavy in my hand. It wasn't just arrogance. It was monstrosity. They were not just a dysfunctional family, they were a nest of vipers capable of murder. As their footsteps receded, I leaned against the cold stone wall, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had known they were greedy. I hadn't known they were killers. I was about to step out to flee back to the safety of the club, when another set of footsteps approached, soft and deliberate. They stopped a few feet away from me. "President Vance," a calm, gentle voice spoke into the darkness. "Did you hear everything that was said just now?" I didn't startle. My fear instantly crystallized into a sharp, calculating coldness. I pulled the wisteria vine aside. Standing there was Cassian Thorn, the illegitimate son, the family's open secret. He was dressed in a dark suit, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable behind his metal-framed glasses. He looked like a scholar, but his eyes held the weary sharpness of a street fighter. I met his gaze, my own just as steady. Mr. Thorn went to such lengths to make sure I heard all that. "What's your point?" He let out a soft, humorless chuckle. "There was no pretense between us. The time for games was over. I want the entire Thorn Empire," he stated, his voice flat and matter-of-fact. "Work with me. When it's done, I'll give you 6% of Thorn Corporation's shares. Your $1.5 billion, principal plus interest, returned in full." I didn't need to think. His motives were written in the hard line of his mouth, in the shadow of pain that flickered in his eyes when his mother was mentioned. Cordelia had taken his mother from him. This was about vengeance. And I was about survival. I extended my hand. His grip was firm, cool. "Deal." The pact was sealed not with a handshake, but with a mutual understanding that we were stepping into a war. And we intended to win. The alliance with Kalin was a ghost in the machine of my daily life. Nothing visibly changed. I continued my reign at the Thorn Manor, my days a structured chaos of corporate conquest and domestic management. Isolde's frantic studying provided a satisfying backdrop. Kalin's sullen avoidance was a bonus. The money I injected into the Thorn Group acted like adrenaline to a dying body. It sparked convulsions. Kalin, under the lash of my financial whip and the looming profit targets, began making drastic changes. He fired long-time, complacent executives. He cut pet projects. He demanded innovation from departments that had been coasting for decades. The internal turmoil was immense. He was making enemies within his own house, and every night he came home looking more haggard, the weight of his crumbling legacy bowing his shoulders. I took my share of the profits from a recent, successful venture, a larger share than the Thorn family was comfortable with. It was my right as the major investor, but it was a right they resented with every fiber of their entitled beings. Finally, it proved too much for Cordelia. Kalin later recounted the scene to me, a rare, grim smile touching his lips. In a board meeting packed with nervous shareholders, the old matriarch had finally snapped. She'd slammed her fist on the polished table, her voice shaking with rage as she pointed a trembling finger at her son. "How did I raise such a useless child?" she had shrieked, the words echoing in the stunned silence. She had then stormed out, leaving a room full of embarrassed, terrified people in her wake. "The old witch is finally losing her composure," Kalin said, his voice low. I laughed, the sound cold in the quiet of my office. "The Thorn family's wretched state is thanks to that old hypocrite with a Buddha's mouth and a viper's heart. What does it matter if I take 40%? Without my investment they'd get zero." Kalin's smile faded. "However, President Vance, you should be careful. Now that the old lady is angry, it won't be long before she moves against you." He adjusted his glasses, the light glinting off the lenses. "She has a favorite method. Car accidents. My mother lost her life that way." He assured me he had people planted close to Cordelia. He would know the moment a plan was set in motion. The moment came sooner than I expected. Kalin, in a desperate attempt to maintain some semblance of normalcy and control, had built a small, private art gallery to showcase Isolde's painfully mediocre oil paintings. The unveiling was a necessary social torture. As always, I refused to share a car with him. Isolde was buried in textbooks, so he was to go alone. Just as he was about to leave, I received an urgent call from Mina. Her voice was pitched high with panic. A key supplier was reneging on our agreed price, threatening to derail a critical project. I had to get to the office immediately. I delivered the news to Kalin with feigned frustration. He was annoyed. My drama was interfering with his schedule, but he merely nodded tersely and turned to leave. It was then that a mechanic hurried up, apologizing profusely. Mr. Thorn's usual car had a minor issue with its internal system. It needed to be looked at immediately. I saw the understanding dawn in Kalin's eyes. He thought it was the signal. He nodded grimly and without a word, climbed into the armored sedan I usually used. The car that had been subtly, meticulously prepared. 5 minutes after he left, I walked calmly to the garage, selected a different, innocuous town car and drove to my office. The supplier crisis, orchestrated by Kalin, was a masterpiece of theatrical panic. I let it play out for an hour, allowing just enough time before solving it with a few sharp commands. I was just stepping out of the conference room, feeling the satisfying hum of a crisis averted, when my personal phone rang. It was an unknown number. A police lieutenant. His voice was professionally grave. "Mrs. Thorn? There's been a severe accident. Your husband's car was T-boned by a freight truck. I'm sorry, the injuries are catastrophic. You need to come to Metropolitan General immediately." A coldness settled over me, a calm so deep it was alien. I instructed my driver. The ride to the hospital was a blur. My mind was clear, processing the steps, the script I would have to follow. Cordelia was already there, a small, furious black-clad figure surrounded by a flock of anxious relatives. When she saw me, the hatred in her eyes was a physical force. She launched herself at me, her fists flailing, her voice a raw scream. "Alara! You vile woman! Why did you harm my son? I only have this one son left. Why?" Mina, my ever-loyal shadow, moved with startling speed. She stepped between us, catching Cordelia's wrists, her own expression icy. "Madam," she said, her voice firm and clear, "we understand your distress, but do not make baseless accusations. President Vance just rushed back from the company after resolving a major emergency. How could she possibly have had time to harm your son?" She paused, her gaze sweeping over the Thorn family. "Speaking of which, how did that truck manage to hit precisely the car that President Vance often drives?" The guilt on their faces was a confession. They looked away, unable to meet her eyes. It was then that Kalin made his entrance. He played his part perfectly, the concerned, dutiful younger son. "Mother," he said, his voice a calming murmur. "Before the police investigation is concluded, perhaps your focus should be on your son." It was the wrong thing to say. Cordelia's grief and rage, sharpened by a lifetime of contempt for him, found a new target. She whirled on him. "Now that your brother is in trouble, you must be the most delighted, aren't you?" Her hand, twisted with age and fury, snapped out and slapped him hard across the face. The sound was shockingly loud in the sterile hallway. Kalin didn't flinch. He simply lowered his head, his fingers gently touching his reddening cheek. When he looked up, his eyes met mine over her head. In them I didn't see pain. I saw a promise. A flame of vengeance that had been banked for decades was now roaring to life. "If anything happens to Kalin," Cordelia hissed, spittle flying from her lips, "none of you will get away with it." She shook off the servants trying to comfort her and stormed away, leaving a vacuum of tense silence. The doctors fought for him for over 10 hours. It was a performance. We all knew it. A person does not survive having their car compacted into a metal cube. The final pronouncement was a formality. Kalin Thorn was dead. Cordelia's wails of grief were cut short by the arrival of new visitors. 2 police officers, their faces stern. The truck driver, realizing he'd killed the prized son and that his promised payout and protection had vanished, had confessed everything the moment the cuffs were on. He named names. Cordelia Thorn was read her rights there in the hospital hallway, surrounded by the smell of antiseptic and failure. Her screams of protest, her claims of status, fell on deaf ears. She was led away, a once powerful matriarch reduced to a handcuffed old woman. The game was over. And we had won. The cost, a man's life, meant nothing to me. He had been willing to sacrifice mine. This was not tragedy. It was justice. The world didn't stop spinning after Kalin's death. If anything, it seemed to spin faster, a dizzying carousel of legal proceedings, boardroom whispers, and the relentless, grinding machinery of corporate governance. The police station was a blur of fluorescent lights and politely worded questions. I played my part flawlessly, the shocked, grieving widow, her horror slowly dawning as the truth was revealed. I urged them to find justice for my husband, my voice trembling with a conviction that felt so real even I almost believed it. When I finally returned to the Thorn Manor, the silence felt different. It wasn't the quiet of resentment anymore. It was the hollow, echoing silence of a palace after the king has been deposed. The staff moved like ghosts, their eyes wide with a new kind of fear. And waiting for me in the grand foyer, a pale, trembling statue in the dim light, was Isolde. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her face was stripped of its usual petulant beauty, replaced by a raw, terrified vulnerability. She was a child who had just realized the world was not a fairy tale, and her prince was not just sleeping but dead and gone. "Kalin is dead," I said. My voice was flat, factual. I felt no need to soften the blow. The world had already done that, and it had been anything but soft. She nodded, a jerky, mechanical motion. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. She just stared at me, her eyes begging for a script, for someone to tell her what to do, what to feel. I placed a hand on her shoulder. It was a calculated gesture, meant to look comforting but feeling as connecting as touching marble. "School must still be attended," I continued, my tone shifting to one of practical concern. The law faculty at the University of Munich has exceptionally high standards. Your current level is still far from meeting them. Keep studying hard. Then I delivered the second, more devastating blow. I leaned in slightly, my gaze holding hers, ensuring she understood every single word. As for the rest, Kalin didn't leave you anything. No shares. No trusts. No properties. Nothing. I let the absolute zero of that statement hang in the air for a moment. Legally, you're not in an adoptive relationship. He had no legal guardianship over you. You won't get a single cent from his estate. The color drained from her face completely, leaving her a ghastly shade of white. Her knees actually buckled and she grabbed the back of a nearby chair to keep from collapsing. The reality of her situation wasn't just dawning, it was crashing down on her like an avalanche. She was utterly alone. A beautiful, expensive ornament with no legal standing, no family, and no protector. The gilded cage had dissolved and she was free falling. I watched her panic, a cold, clinical observer. This was a necessary pruning. A loose end that needed to be tied off, neatly and permanently. Seeing the raw, animal terror in her eyes, I decided the carrot was needed after the stick. I gave a slight nod to the woman who had been waiting discreetly in the shadow of the staircase. My personal lawyer, Miss Chen, stepped forward. She was a picture of calm efficiency in a sharp black suit. "Miss Thorn," she said, her voice gentle but firm. She took Isolde's cold, limp hand and pressed a sheaf of papers into it. "As your stepmother, President Vance won't leave you to fend for yourself." Isolde looked down at the document, her eyes uncomprehending. "This agreement stipulates," Ms. Chen explained calmly, "that as long as you promise not to participate in the Thorn family's internal conflicts in the future and refrain from acting within the Thorn family under the identity of Kalin Thorn's adopted daughter, you have the right to receive the following assets." She listed them off, each item a life raft thrown to a drowning woman. Full tuition and living expenses for her studies in Germany, $50 million in cash, the deed to 2 luxury apartments in the most desirable district of the capital, and full ownership of every piece of jewelry, every handbag, every expensive trinket Kalin had ever given her. Isolde's eyes grew wider with each item. It was a fortune. A life of incredible luxury and absolute independence, far from the toxic ruins of the Thorn family. The choice was stark: sign and secure a future of wealth and freedom, or refuse and be cast adrift with nothing but the clothes on her back. She looked from the contract to my face, then toward the closed door of Kalin's study, as if hoping he would emerge to save her. There was only silence. Her survival instinct, buried under years of pampered dependence, roared to the surface. She grabbed my arm, her fingers clutching at my sleeve with desperate strength. "I'm willing," she gasped, her voice urgent, almost frantic. "I'm willing to sign. Give me the agreement. I'll sign it right now." "Where's the pen?" Miss Chen produced a pen. Isolde scrawled her name on the dotted line without even reading the fine print, her hand shaking so badly the signature was a messy scrawl. It was done. I allowed myself a small internal smile of satisfaction. The jewelry alone was worth a fortune. Combined with the cash and property, it was a generous payoff, a more than fair price to permanently remove a potential claimant, a rival, a symbol of the past from the board. It was a bargain. A week later, I stood at the international terminal of the airport. Isolde was a small figure amidst her luggage, her face pale but set with a new determination. The diamonds I had given her were gone, packed away. She looked like what she now was: a student, albeit an incredibly wealthy one, heading off to forge her own path. "Good luck," I said, my tone perfunctory. She nodded, not meeting my eyes. "Thank you, Mother." The title was empty now, a hollow formality. She turned and walked toward the security gate without a backward glance. She was erasing herself from my story, and I was delighted to see her go. With her departure, a tangible silence settled over the manor. It was a clean silence. I could breathe again. I turned my attention to the complex, satisfying work of untangling the assets I had inherited from Kalin. The business marriage, though brief, had been brutally effective. I was now a significant minority shareholder in the wounded Thorn Group, a position that granted me not just wealth, but a powerful voice on its board of directors. The dowry had been a weapon, and it had bought me a key to the very inner sanctum I was meant to be excluded from. The power vacuum left by Cordelia's arrest and Kalin's death was a feeding frenzy. The extended Thorn family, a hydra of greedy cousins and uncles, descended, each head snapping for a piece of the carcass. But they hadn't accounted for Kalin. While they were bickering over bones, he was moving with the quiet, ruthless efficiency of a surgeon. The patient, professional manager became a predator. He used the connections he'd built over years of actually running the company, combined with a dossier of damning information on his rivals. Embezzlement, insider trading, sexual misconduct, that he had doubtless been compiling for a decade. One by one they were neutralized, bought off or publicly ruined. The internal struggle was short, vicious, and utterly decisive. Within a matter of weeks, Kalin Thorn, the illegitimate son from the slums, emerged as the new majority shareholder and undisputed head of the Thorn Group. On the day I went to the Thorn headquarters to formally take my seat on the board, the atmosphere was electric. The building itself felt different, the air charged with a new nervous energy. He was waiting for me in the lobby. Not the Kalin of old, the man who lingered in the background. This was a king in a razor-sharp suit, his metal-framed glasses reflecting the bright lights of the empire he had just conquered. "President Vance," he said, a genuine relaxed smile touching his lips for the first time since I'd known him. It transformed his face. "Would you join me for a cup of coffee?" I agreed. I expected him to lead me to some exclusive members' club, a place befitting his new status. Instead, he held open the door to a simple, bright coffee shop on the ground floor of the building adjacent to the Thorn Tower. It was all light wood and large windows, filled with the quiet hum of white-collar workers on their breaks. He brought 2 steaming cups to the small table where I sat. I took mine, smiling. "I thought you'd take me somewhere fancier." Kalin shook his head, sitting down and looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows. The morning sun streamed in, catching the dust motes in the air and painting a warm stripe across the table. For a long moment he didn't speak. He just watched the people rushing by on the sidewalk. "When I was a boy," he began, his voice softer, almost nostalgic, "on my way to a scholarship class I used to pass by here. I'd press my face against the glass and watch the people inside. The women in their smart suits, the men with their briefcases. They looked like they owned the world." He took a slow sip of his coffee. "I thought to myself, one day I'll work here. I'll earn money and buy my mother a house with a garden." He fell silent again, his gaze distant. "Later I became the master here. But my mother was no longer around to see it." The raw, unexpected grief in his voice was a stark contrast to the polished corporate warrior beside me. Some time ago he told me he had dug up his mother's case and demanded a retrial. He had evidence, cold and irrefutable, that Cordelia had orchestrated the accident that killed her. With Cordelia in custody and the Thorn name mud, the courts had listened. The case was being reopened. He came back to himself and saw me watching him. A faint flush touched his cheeks as if embarrassed by his moment of vulnerability. "Sorry for making President Sean laugh." "Don't be," I said, and I meant it. His pain was real. It was the engine that had driven him. It was what made him a reliable ally. "President Vance has done me a great favor," he said, shifting back into his professional mode, though the warmth remained. "If you ever have any needs in the capital in the future, don't hesitate to come to me. The internal strife isn't completely over, but..." He smiled, a sharp, confident flash of teeth. "I believe I can manage it." We spoke for a few more minutes about board schedules and shareholder meetings. Then he stood, extending his hand. "I look forward to working with you." I shook it. "Likewise." He left first. I stayed for a few minutes, finishing my coffee. I looked out the window he had gazed through as a child. The early autumn sunlight was bright, the trees along the avenue still lush and green. It had been just over half a year since I'd arrived in the capital, a bride in a transactional marriage. Now I had built a new corporate headquarters, I held a powerful stake in a legacy empire, and I had just solidified an alliance with its ruthless, brilliant new king. My future, my real future, was no longer something I was building toward. It was here. It was now. And it was mine. The coffee shop's warmth faded from my skin the moment I stepped back onto the pavement, replaced by the capital's crisp autumn air. It carried a new scent now, not just of dying leaves and exhaust, but of possibility. Raw, unfiltered possibility. Kalin's confession, his moment of unveiled grief, hadn't softened me. It had armed me. Understanding an ally's motive is the greatest strategic advantage one can have. His was vengeance, a clean, sharp blade. Mine was dominion. They were not mutually exclusive. The Thorn Group's headquarters, that imposing edifice of glass and steel, no longer felt like a fortress I was besieging. The lobby doors slid open for me without a hint of resistance. The receptionists who had once offered polite, condescending smiles, now dipped their heads in a swift, nervous motion. President Vance. The title was no longer a marital appendage. It was a title of power earned and acknowledged. My office within the Thorn building was not as large as Cashin's, but it was mine. I had chosen it for the view, not of the manicured inner courtyard, but of the bustling city artery below. My kingdom being built, merger by merger, acquisition by acquisition. The first board meeting was a masterclass in subdued tension. The old guard, the surviving cousins and uncles who had been too insignificant for Cashin to purge, sat stiffly around the polished table. They looked at me as if I were a venomous spider who had somehow been voted into their treehouse. Cashin presided with a calm, unnerving authority. He didn't need to raise his voice. A single look from him, a quiet question, was enough to make seasoned executives stammer. I said little. I observed. I learned the rhythm of their fear, the cadence of their resentment. When I did speak, it was to ask a pointed question about liquidity ratios in the Asian markets. The question was not for the CFO who spluttered through an answer but for the room. A reminder that I was not there as a silent beneficiary. I was a player. After the meeting, one of the older uncles, a man with a face like a crumpled paper bag, approached me. A tragedy about Kalin, he said, his voice oozing a false sincerity. And poor Cordelia. The stress must have unhinged her. To make such absurd accusations. I met his watery gaze without blinking. The police seem to think the evidence is quite compelling, I said, my tone neutral. I suppose we should all believe in the process of justice. Don't you agree? He paled slightly and mumbled an agreement before scurrying away. The message was sent. I would not be a vessel for their revisionist history. The past was a weapon and I would wield it as I saw fit. My days fell into a new, powerful rhythm. Mornings were spent at my own company's headquarters, where the air was vibrant with the energy of something I had built from the ground up. My team, led by the fiercely capable Mina, was young, hungry, and untainted by the capital's old money ennui. We were sharks in a tank of complacent fish. Afternoons were often spent at the Thorn Group. Cashin and I developed a working rhythm. Our conversations were brief, conducted in hallways or over rushed cups of coffee, always away from eavesdropping ears. We spoke in a kind of shorthand, a language of asset allocations, stock buybacks, and hostile takeover targets. The 6% of shares he had promised me were transferred without fanfare. The digital confirmation appeared in my portfolio one morning, a number with more zeros than most people see in a lifetime. The $1.5 billion, he assured me, would follow once the company's cash flow stabilized. I believed him. Trust was irrelevant. Our interests were perfectly aligned. He was a fascinating study in power. The refined, almost scholarly exterior hid a core of tempered steel. I saw him in meetings, dismantling a rival's argument with surgical precision. I saw the way the staff jumped to fulfill his slightest request. The memory of the slapped-faced illegitimate son was gone, erased by the chillingly efficient suit. One evening, I was working late in my Thorn office when he appeared at my open door. The building was quiet, most of its inhabitants having fled to their dinners and families. A progress report, he said, leaning against the doorframe. The retrial for my mother's case has been scheduled. The evidence is overwhelming. There was no joy in his statement, only a grim finality. And Cordelia? I asked, setting down my pen. Her health is failing in the detention center, he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. The doctors say it's the stress. I think it's the absence of power. It was the only thing keeping her alive. I nodded. It was a fitting end. To be stripped of the very thing she had killed for. The vultures are circling, he continued, meaning the remaining Thorn relatives. But they have no teeth. The company is stabilizing. Faster than I anticipated. He gave me a look then, one that held a sliver of something that wasn't strictly business. Your investment didn't just provide capital. It provided credibility. I know, I said simply. A faint smile touched his lips. He pushed himself off the doorframe. Don't work too late, partner. The word hung in the air after he left. Partner. It was more accurate than wife had ever been. I left the office an hour later. My driver navigated the brightly lit streets toward the Thorn Manor. But as we passed the iron gates, I felt a sudden visceral revulsion. The house was a museum of someone else's failed dynasty. A gilded shell filled with bad memories and the ghost of a man I despised. Turn around, I told the driver. Take me to the Pinnacle Towers. The penthouse apartment was my sanctuary, a space I'd purchased under a holding company months ago. It was all clean lines, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a breathtaking view of the city skyline. It held no history. It held only my future. I poured a glass of expensive whiskey and stood at the window. The city was a tapestry of light below me, a circuit board of power and ambition. I could trace the path of my influence now. The Vance Holdings Tower, a needle of light to the east. The Thorn Group's hulking presence to the west. And me, here in the center, the conductor of a silent, powerful symphony. My phone buzzed. A text from my mother. Heard you made old man Pembroke sweat in the board meeting today. My girl. I smiled, a real one this time. I typed back. Just pruning the dead wood. I thought of Isolde, probably in a Munich library, her life now defined by torts and precedents instead of a man's fleeting attention. I thought of Kalin, buried and forgotten. I thought of Cordelia rotting in a cell. And I thought of Kalin finally claiming the birthright that had been stolen from his mother. They were all pieces on a board, their moves completed. The game I had come to the capital to play was over. I had won. But as I looked out at the endless, sparkling grid of the city, I felt no urge to rest. Winning one game just revealed the next, larger board. This wasn't an ending. It was an opening move. The silence in the penthouse was immense, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the hum of the city, the whisper of transactions, the silent flow of capital. It was my kind of silence. I took a sip of whiskey, the burn of familiar comfort. The future was an unwritten contract. And I was ready to dictate the terms. The end.